What's up, guys? Hope you're having a good day. So we're all very familiar with this famous MMA meme of Dana turning to the camera and saying that's fucking illegal. But very few people know the story behind this meme and where it came from. And it's actually very relevant to everything that's going on with Muhammad Mokaev at the moment. So in this video, we're going to talk about what the UFC are doing to Mokaev at the moment. We're also going to be talking about why it's very hypocritical, and we're also going to be taking a trip down memory lane. We're going to be jumping in the MMA time machine to discuss the origins of this meme, to show you where it came from, and to show you why, because of this meme, I feel Mokaev is being very unfairly treated by the UFC at the moment. So Muhammad Mokaev is a young, hungry, up-and-coming prospect in the UFC's flyweight division who's not that far away from a title shot, and at just 23 years old, he went out last Saturday and picked up a solid win against one of the best flyweights in the division. And how did the UFC reward him for this incredible achievement? They rewarded him by not even re-signing him to the promotion. They're not even going to renew his contract. Now, the UFC haven't outright come and explained the reasons why they're not going to re-sign Mokaev, but Dana White in his post-event interview did allude to it being down to Mokaev's behaviour outside of the octagon. A few months ago, there were rumoured to be an incident at the UFC Performance Institute involving Mokaev, and of course, last week, there was also another incident involving Manel Kape and his team in the Fighter Hotel. Now, if a professional sports organisation wants to punish fighters or athletes for unprofessional behaviour and they want to ban or suspend them or punish them in another way, I've got absolutely no problem with that. It happens across all sports. But I think it's very important to be consistent, and this is the area where the UFC are really starting to piss me off. They're incredibly inconsistent, and how they treat their fighters really comes down to how charismatic and how popular a fighter is, and now it's even coming down to what their fighting style is like. So I've got absolutely no problem with the UFC not re-signing Muhammad Mokaev if they don't want to re-sign him because of his behaviour outside of the octagon. But what he did at the Fighter Hotel last week or at the UFC Performance Institute must have been pretty serious for them to not re-sign him, when we have seen the UFC allow Conor McGregor to keep fighting in the promotion after punching a 70-year-old man in a bar. We have seen Jon Jones run over a pregnant woman and flee the scene, and we've seen countless other examples of big stars in the UFC face pretty serious allegations and do pretty bad things, and yet the UFC continue to promote them and allow them to earn a living as a UFC fighter. So if what Mokaev did at the Performance Institute and at the Fighter Hotel last week is so bad that it is worse than punching a 70-year-old man in a bar or hitting a pregnant lady in the street and driving off, I think they need to come out and tell us. Because at the moment, the way they've treated him compared to people like Jon Jones and Conor McGregor just feels incredibly inconsistent. But there are, of course, other reasons why the UFC may not have re-signed Mokaev to the promotion. And the fighter himself said after his victory over Manel Kape on Saturday night that the UFC had made it very clear to him that they didn't like his style of fighting, and alluded to finding his style of fighting boring. They were trying to get him to fight with a more exciting style. Let's listen to the interview so you can hear it straight from Mokaev himself.
Thank you.
In front. Did they try to give you a new contract before this fight?
They said they're gonna see how I perform. They don't want to see me keep shooting and taking somebody down, but I've done what I could do with like tonight, yeah.
They said they didn't like you shooting in there? Is that what they said?
Yeah, they don't like this because they try to get rid of flyweights before, and they don't want this kind of fight. But listen, I'm young. I'm still not in my prime. Mm-hmm. Like, if they want me to stand and bank with toe-to-toe with these, like, 30 years old grown men, I have to do what's best for me to win.
So when I heard this, I was pretty disgusted, because the UFC are supposed to be a professional sports organisation, and now it appears they're trying to influence the way that professional athletes compete, which is a very strange legal grey area and a very dark road to go down. But their argument will be, it's an entertainment business. They're independent contractors. They're paying these fighters, and they want to put on the most exciting fights possible for the fans. But we're getting into a real strange territory with the UFC at the moment, where I don't think they know whether they want to be a proper sports league or they want to be an entertainment business like the WWE. And I don't think this is good for the integrity of the sport. And of course, this isn't the first time that it's happened. We know guys like John Fitch and Jake Shields ran into similar problems with the UFC. But those guys weren't 23-year-old undefeated prospects. And I just think if this really is the reason why the UFC aren't re-signing Mokaev, it is incredibly unfair to him. But as well as treating Muhammad Mokaev very unfairly, I also feel they're being very inconsistent with this issue. Now, we've already spoken about how the UFC is inconsistent when it comes to punishing fighters depending on how popular and how big of a star the fighter is, but they're also very inconsistent in how they view different situations. And one of the best examples of inconsistency in the UFC we have took place all the way back in 2008, and it's actually the origin for this very famous Dana White meme. So if we step into the UFC time machine and go all the way back in history, all the way back to 2008, I've got something very interesting to share with you. So back in 2008, the UFC were the biggest MMA promotion in the world. They were the dominant force, but they weren't as big as they are now. It was still a relatively new sport, and as a result, you had lots of different MMA promotions popping up to try and take market share from the UFC and become the dominant force. And they all pretty much used the same business model. They would sign big stars or big ex-UFC fighters or big fighters from other promotions or sports, and they would try and draw in an audience and get attention from those big names. And one of the promotions that tried to do this was called Elite XC. And one of the big stars that they signed back then was the legend Kimbo Slice, who's obviously a famous street fighter. He had a huge audience, a huge presence online. And they matched him up against Seth Petrozelli, who was a former UFC fighter. Now, obviously, this is a big problem because Kimbo Slice was a street fighter. He came from a striking background, and we all know how guys like that usually do in the UFC. They usually struggle pretty bad when they first get into MMA because obviously they've got no takedown defense and no ground game. And Elite XC knew this. They knew if they put Kimbo Slice up against an MMA fighter, he would probably get taken down and dominated because he didn't have any experience when it came to grappling. But they were paying Kimbo Slice a huge amount of money to fight in the promotion, and they were trying to build their company off the back of stars like Slice. So what did they do? They paid Seth Petrozelli extra money not to grapple. And we know this because a week after the fight, Petrozelli went onto a radio show and he said that they offered him extra money in exchange for promising that he wouldn't take Kimbo Slice down. He later tried to walk those comments back and say that he was just making it up. But obviously, once you put it out there and say something like that, it isn't easy to walk it back. Now, we don't know if Petrozelli just made that up or if it was the truth. But either way, that's what Seth Petrozelli said. Now, the irony is that we don't know if Elite XC actually did that or not. We don't even know if Seth Petrozelli took the money in exchange for promising not to grapple. And the reason why we don't have the answers to those questions, or one of the big reasons, is because the fight actually ended in 14 seconds and Seth Petrozelli didn't even need to grapple. We can see the fight here. What actually happened is as Kimbo Slice came forward, Seth Petrozelli knocked him out with a short counter, and the fight was done in 14 seconds. We didn't even need to grapple. So at this point, you're probably wondering what Kimbo Slice and Elite XC has got to do with Mokaev, the UFC, and Dana White. Now, we all know that Dana can be quite defensive and combative, and back in 2008, the MMA landscape was very different to how it is now. The UFC were the #1 MMA promotion, but they had a lot more competition back then. And you'd have new promotions popping up all the time with wealthy investors behind them who were trying to crush the UFC and establish themselves as the #1 MMA promotion. We know that the UFC eventually came out on top. back in 2008, it was a much more competitive marketplace, and Elite XC were one of the companies or one of the promotions trying to tackle the UFC head on. So these days we don't really hear Dana talk about other MMA promotions that often, but back in 2008 it was totally different. It was a much more competitive marketplace, and because of that, Dana was combative and hostile towards other MMA promotions because he was in competition with them. So whenever another promotion would make a mistake or do something that he disagreed with, he would attack them for it. And so, of course, when Seth Petrozelli revealed that Elite XC had offered to pay him more money if he didn't wrestle, Dana was ready to jump all over it and give his opinions on what he thought about what Elite XC did. And that is the origin for the "that's fucking illegal" meme. And let's play the interview so you can see the context behind exactly where it came from.
The idiot Gary Shaw actually does an interview with the LA Times, okay? And he says that, we didn't do anything wrong. There's nothing wrong with paying a guy to stand up. We got no problem doing that. Yes, you scumbag. There is a problem with that. Think about this. Mandalay Bay and the Venetian both had betting on this. You, the consumer, the mixed martial arts fan, could go in and bet on this fight, okay? Now, anybody that's going to bet on this fight is going to think, well, if Seth Petrozelli can get him to the ground, the fight's over. So I'm going to bet, take a chance that Seth's going to get him down and submit him. But you don't know the scumbag promoters behind the scenes went in and paid him to not go to the ground. They paid him to stand up. You know why? Because they thought that Kimbo Slice was going to viciously knock him out. But Kimbo Slice sucks. Like I've said now for the last few months, this fucking guy can't fight, and he got knocked out in 13 seconds by a guy who didn't win the Ultimate Fighter and who didn't win fights in the UFC. They brought him up from the undercard to fight the main event guy and knocked him out in 13 seconds. It would be like the NFL, okay? There's a game between the Patriots and the Browns. The NFL goes into the locker rooms and tells the players, listen, the Patriots pull higher ratings if they make it to the playoffs and to the Super Bowl than the Browns do. So here's what we're going to do. The Browns have a great running game. We're going to pay your team more money if you just pass tonight, don't run. Because we need the Patriots to win and make it to the next level. That's fucking illegal. They're being investigated by the Florida Athletic Commission. They ought to be investigated right now by the FBI too. And Gary Shaw, if you think going to the ground is boring, and Jeremy Lappin and rapper, whatever the fuck your name is, Shaw Jr., okay? That's called mixed martial arts. You fucking morons need to be in the kickboxing business. If that's what you're selling, you're paying guys to stand up. They don't care about mixed martial arts. These fucking jerk-offs are in it for the money. These guys want to come in, take a piece of the pie, and in it, they don't give a fuck if they destroy the whole sport. Me and my crew have been busting our ass for 10 years to show people how amazing this sport is, the type of people that are involved in this sport, the athletes, how amazing they are, and you've got these boxing scumbags coming in and trying to fix fights. It's unbelievable.
This interview is absolutely shocking because what the UFC are doing to Muhammad Mokaev is very similar to what Dana White heavily criticised Elite XC for doing all the way back in 2008. Now I get it, the UFC aren't directly offering Mokaev an amount of money to fight in a very specific way, like Elite XC were alleged to have done with Seth Petrozelli back in 2008. However, this is an example of an MMA promotion trying to influence the way in which a fighter performs by telling Mokaev that they don't like his fighting style. Consider the stage of Mokaev's career that he's in. He's a young, up-and-coming prospect that wants to build a bright future in the sport and a big career in the UFC. If your boss, if your employer comes to you and they say they don't like the way that you're performing, obviously you're going to try and change the way you perform to please them and give them what they want. And so it's no surprise to see Mokaev stand and strike with Cap last weekend instead of using his usual style of having a grappling heavy game plan. And now in this interview, Dana White even said that the owners of Elite XC should be investigated by the FBI for trying to influence how Seth Petrozelli performed because people were able to bet on this fight. Take a look and listen to this for yourself.
Think about this. Mandalay Bay and the Venetian both had betting on this. You, the consumer, the mixed martial arts fan, could go in and bet on this fight, okay? Now, anybody that's going to bet on this fight is going to think, well, if Seth Petrozelli can get him to the ground, the fight's over. So I'm going to bet, take a chance that Seth's going to get him down and submit him. But you don't know the scumbag promoters behind the scenes went in and paid him to not go to the ground. They paid him to stand up. You know why? Because they thought that Kimbo Slice was going to viciously knock him out. But Kimbo Slice sucks. Like I've said now for the last few months, this fucking guy can't fight, and he got knocked out in 13 seconds by a guy who didn't win the Ultimate Fighter and who didn't win fights in the UFC.
So Dana's out here saying that Elite XC should be investigated for trying to influence how a fighter performs, because people may have been betting on Seth Petrozelli on the assumption that he would look to take Kimbo Slice down and out-grapple him. But how is that any different from putting pressure on Muhammad Mokaev not to grapple in his fights? This seems like pretty much the same thing to me. Imagine all those people that placed bets on Muhammad Mokaev last week, expecting him to fight like he usually does. Obviously, if you're familiar with Muhammad Mokaev's fighting style, he usually uses very, very grappling-heavy game plans. Last weekend against Manel Kape, he didn't do that. In fact, he didn't use much grappling at all. He barely shot a takedown. Instead, he tried to stand and strike with Manel Kape and was able to get the job done. But I think a big part of the reason why Mokaev had so much success on the feet was because Kape injured his foot in the second round. Had he not suffered that injury, we could have been in a situation where the UFC influenced Mokaev not to grapple. Mokaev didn't grapple and then ended up losing the fight. Now, what about all the people that would have placed bets on Mokaev and potentially taken a loss because Mokaev didn't grapple? This feels very, very hypocritical from Dana White to say this about Elite XC when we know what the UFC have been doing to put pressure on Mokaev to influence his fighting style. But the inconsistencies don't stop there. Listen to what Dana's got to say next.
That's fucking illegal. They're being investigated by the Florida Athletic Commission. They ought to be investigated right now by the FBI too. And Gary Shaw, if you think going to the ground is boring, and Jeremy Lappin and rapper, whatever the fuck your name is, Shaw Jr., okay, that's called mixed martial arts. You fucking morons need to be in the kickboxing business. If that's what you're selling, you're paying guys to stand up. They don't care about mixed martial arts. These fucking jerk-offs are in it for the money. These guys want to come in, take a piece of the pie, and in it, they don't give a fuck if they destroy the whole sport. Me and my crew have been busting our ass for 10 years to show people how amazing this sport is, the type of people that are involved in this sport, the athletes, how amazing they are, and you've got these boxing scumbags coming in and trying to fix fights. It's unbelievable.
Just listen to the hypocrisy of Dana White in this interview, where today he is doing the exact same thing to Muhammad Mokaev that he criticised boxing promoters for doing when they entered the MMA space back in 2008. In this interview, he criticises boxing promoters for not respecting the ground game, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the grappling as a martial art, and now he is doing the exact same thing. It is so inconsistent and it is so hypocritical. It's very frustrating to watch because this is another example of how Mokaev is being treated very unfairly. And we all know why Dana White was passionate about grappling back in 2008. It was because we were in a different time. The UFC and mixed martial arts as a sport was struggling to break through into the mainstream. And Dana White was trying to build the company and build the UFC to the point where it would be taken seriously like other major sports. In order to do that, he needed to get the sport legalized in states like New York City. So he went with a narrative of the UFC being a place where martial artists from all different disciplines could come and showcase their skills. And of course that is true. But one of the ways that he did this was frequently talking about how he and Lorenzo Fertitta were passionate about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, passionate about grappling, and passionate about the sport of mixed martial arts. It worked, and obviously the UFC became legalized across all of the United States and most of the world. But isn't it funny how as soon as the UFC achieved their goals, Dana White changes his perspective on what it is or what it means to be a mixed martial arts fighter? Why has he changed his opinion so much compared to how he felt back in 2008? And why is he treating Mokaev in this way? Why does he care what Mokaev's fighting style is like? I thought he loved grappling, and Mokaev is a pretty good grappler from my perspective. So I guess what Harvey Dent said in Batman is true. You either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
They appointed to protect the Republic was named Caesar, and he never gave up his power.
Okay, fine.
You either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.